Something changes without announcing itself, not in a way that draws attention, not with an argument or an event that can be pointed to later. It happens the way light changes in a room when the sun moves behind a cloud, almost imperceptible at first, until the colors are no longer what they were a moment ago. You still wake up in the same bed, still recognize your reflection, still carry the same memories, but there is a faint sense that something has shifted just enough to be felt, but not enough to be named. Decisions that once flowed through you without resistance now hesitate. You pause longer than you used to. You find yourself waiting not because you need to, but because waiting has quietly become part of the process. There is no single line that says you are no longer in charge, yet the feeling of authorship over your own day feels thinner, stretched, as if handled too often by other hands. You notice it in the smallest moments, moments that would sound trivial if spoken aloud, which is why they are rarely spoken at all. Choosing when to leave the house, what to eat, how late to stay up, how much energy to spend on something that matters only to you. None of these choices are denied outright, they are simply surrounded by opinions, suggestions, concerns, reminders, gentle warnings, and well-intentioned comments that carry the faint implication that you might not see the full picture anymore. Nothing dramatic has happened, yet something is missing. And the absence is not loud enough to demand attention, but persistent enough to be felt every day. At first it feels like courtesy. People check in more. They ask how you are feeling, if you are tired, if you need anything. The tone is soft, careful, sometimes even affectionate. It would be ungrateful to object. It would feel rude to resist. You tell yourself this is normal, that it comes with time, that everyone reaches a point where others naturally step closer. And yet, beneath the surface of that closeness, there is a subtle reordering. Conversations begin to tilt. The phrasing changes. Instead of asking what you plan to do, people ask if you are up for doing it. Instead of assuming you will handle something, they ask if you would prefer someone else to take care of it. These questions are framed as kindness, and in many ways they are. But kindness has weight, and weight changes balance. Slowly, without accusation or conflict, the center of gravity shifts away from you. You are still present, still consulted in appearance, but the expectation that you will decide has softened. Others are ready to step in, sometimes before you have even finished thinking. You start noticing that your answers are met with relief when they align with what was already assumed. When they do not, there is a pause, a moment of recalibration, as if your choice needs to be rechecked against an invisible standard of appropriateness. You feel it, even if you cannot articulate it, the sense that your decisions are now provisional, open to adjustment, subject to reassurance. There is a quiet discomfort in realizing that nothing has been taken from you by force. No one has declared you incapable. No document has been signed. No authority has arrived to redefine your role. And yet, autonomy rarely disappears through confrontation. It erodes through accommodation, through the gradual acceptance of help that comes with unspoken conditions, through the habit of explaining yourself when you never had to before. You catch yourself justifying choices that once needed no defense. Why you want to go out today. Why you are not tired yet. Why you prefer to do something your own way. The explanations slip out automatically, almost apologetically, as if your independence now requires a reason. That is when awareness begins, not as a sharp realization, but as a low, steady unease. The sense that your internal authority is being quietly renegotiated without your explicit consent. You are still deciding, but the perimeter around those decisions has narrowed and you are not entirely sure when that happened. It shows up in routines first. The repetition of days that once felt like a personal rhythm now feels slightly adjusted, as if tuned by someone else's expectations. Appointments are scheduled with more input. Plans are made with more contingencies. There is an increased emphasis on safety, on convenience, on what makes sense at this stage. The phrase "at this stage" appears more often, sometimes spoken aloud, sometimes implied. It carries with it a gentle finality, a suggestion that certain lines have already been crossed, that certain options now belong to the past. You notice how easily that phrase settles into conversations, how rarely it is questioned. It is not meant to diminish you, yet it frames your life as something that must be managed carefully, like an object with instructions attached. You start to feel the weight of being considered. Consideration can be comforting, but it can also be confining. It wraps around you softly, reducing friction, smoothing edges, until the sharpness of your own preference begins to fade. You adapt without noticing, choosing what causes the least concern, what requires the least explanation, what fits most easily into the version of you others seem to expect. Awareness does not arrive as anger. It arrives as a quiet, internal check, a moment where you realize you are not entirely certain whose comfort you are prioritizing anymore. You begin to notice the subtle fatigue that comes from constant accommodation, not physical fatigue, but something more internal. The tiredness of adjusting yourself to be easier to support, easier to advise, easier to guide. You realize that the effort is invisible because it is emotional rather than practical. No one sees it. No one thanks you for it. It is simply assumed that this is how things progress. You tell yourself that this is maturity, that it is reasonable, that it would be stubborn to resist. But somewhere beneath that reasoning, there is a quieter voice, one that does not argue, does not accuse, does not demand. It simply observes. It notes that you are less spontaneous, that you hesitate before expressing a preference, that you weigh your words more carefully, not out of wisdom but out of anticipation of how they will be received. That voice does not yet know what to do with these observations. It is not planning a response. It is only paying attention. There is a moment, often overlooked, when you realize that people are no longer surprised by your compliance, only by your resistance. Agreement has become the default. Saying yes feels natural, expected, even praised. Saying no creates a ripple, not a dramatic one, but enough to be felt. A slight tightening in the room, a careful follow-up question, "Are you sure?" "We just thought it might be easier. We were only trying to help." These phrases are not accusations, but they function as gentle corrections. They remind you of the unspoken contract. You can choose as long as your choice aligns with concern, as long as it does not disrupt the smooth functioning of care. Awareness grows in these moments, not as rebellion, but as recognition. You see that independence is not challenged openly. It is softened, made optional, treated as something you can relinquish gradually, one small decision at a time without ever being asked directly if you are willing to do so. What makes this realization unsettling is its subtlety. There is no clear point of resistance, no obvious line in the sand. Everything feels reasonable when viewed in isolation. Of course, someone should help with that. Of course, it makes sense to be cautious. Of course, they mean well, and they do. Most of the time, there is no malice in the shift, only momentum. A social understanding that moves quietly, carrying you with it unless you consciously anchor yourself. Awareness, then, is not about blaming others or rejecting care. It is about noticing the internal cost of never asserting the simple truth that you are still the primary authority over your own life. That truth does not need to be spoken aloud to exist, but it does need to be recognized internally. Without that recognition, autonomy dissolves not because it is taken, but because it is no longer claimed. You begin to see how language participates in this process. Not harsh language, but soft, considerate phrasing that subtly relocates control. "Let me take care of that for you. You do not need to worry about this anymore. It is probably better if we handle it this way." Each sentence sounds protective, even loving, yet each one gently positions you on the receiving end rather than the deciding end. Awareness sharpens when you notice how often these phrases appear in places where no assistance was actually requested. You realize that the offer itself carries an assumption, that your capacity is now questionable enough to warrant preemptive support. Again, no one says this directly. It lives between the words. You start to sense that the most significant changes in autonomy are not marked by loss of ability, but by loss of expectation. Others no longer expect you to decide first. They expect to step in, to suggest, to manage. And over time, you begin to meet that expectation without noticing the adjustment happening inside you. There is a particular quiet sadness in recognizing that you have begun to self-edit. Not because you doubt yourself, but because you anticipate doubt from others. You choose not to mention certain plans. You simplify explanations. You present your decisions in a way that sounds responsible, measured, reasonable. You remove the parts that might sound impulsive, unnecessary, or indulgent. This self-editing feels mature on the surface, but awareness reveals its deeper function. It is not about clarity, it is about acceptability. You are shaping your independence into a form that will not alarm anyone. In doing so, you are slowly learning where the invisible boundaries lie. You are discovering, without anyone telling you outright, which choices will be supported and which will require negotiation. Awareness does not judge this adaptation, it simply sees it. The realization deepens when you understand that this shift is not unique to you. It is part of a broader pattern, one that affects many lives quietly, politely, under the guise of care. Knowing this does not make it easier. In some ways, it makes it more complex. There is no villain to confront, no system to overthrow. There is only a gradual repositioning, a slow drift from being the center of your own decisions to being one voice among several, sometimes not even the loudest one. Awareness is the moment you stop drifting without knowing it. It is the moment you recognize that independence is not only about physical capability or mental sharpness, but about the subtle authority you hold over your own choices. That authority can be diminished long before strength fades, long before clarity is lost, long before any official acknowledgement of change occurs. This awareness is quiet, almost private. It does not demand action yet. It does not insist on confrontation or correction. It simply sits with you, observing how often you defer, how easily you accept guidance that you did not ask for, how quickly you adjust to being managed instead of consulted. It notices how the world around you has begun to treat your autonomy as something conditional, something that can be overridden by concern. And it notices, perhaps most importantly, how you have begun to cooperate with that shift without realizing what it costs you internally. Nothing dramatic has happened, yet something is missing. The missing thing is not freedom in the abstract, but the subtle, everyday experience of being the unquestioned author of your own life. Awareness is the first time you allow yourself to name that absence, even if only silently, even if only for a moment. Recognition does not arrive as a sudden revelation. It unfolds slowly, like a pattern you begin to see only after it has repeated itself enough times to feel familiar. At first, you might mistake it for coincidence, for circumstance, for a natural adjustment that everyone goes through. But over time, the repetition becomes undeniable. You begin to see how offers of help appear at the exact moment your own initiative would have emerged, how concern consistently precedes your choice, shaping the direction before you have fully articulated it. Recognition is the moment you stop asking whether this is accidental and start noticing the structure beneath it. You realize that help, when repeated without invitation, stops being support and begins to function as guidance. Guidance, when persistent, becomes direction. Direction, when unquestioned, becomes control. None of this happens abruptly. It happens through habits, through tones of voice, through patterns of interaction that feel reasonable in isolation, but unmistakable when viewed together. You start to recognize how easily concern can slide into permission. Not explicit permission, but the subtle kind that assumes authority without declaring it. Someone expresses worry, and suddenly your choice feels subject to review. Someone frames a suggestion as being in your best interest, and the space to disagree quietly shrinks. The language is careful, rarely commanding, but its effect is cumulative. It establishes a hierarchy where your decision is no longer final by default. It must be filtered through reassurance, practicality, and approval. Recognition is the moment you see that this filtering has become automatic, that your autonomy now passes through several hands before it is considered acceptable. You notice how often your own voice is framed as one factor among many, rather than the determining one. You are still included, but inclusion is not the same as authority. Patterns reveal themselves most clearly in moments of friction, not loud conflicts, but subtle hesitations. When you state a preference that does not align with what others expect, the room shifts slightly. There is a pause, a recalibration, a gentle pushback disguised as clarification. Are you sure that is a good idea? We just want to make sure you are comfortable. It might be easier if we did it this way. These responses are not arguments. They are adjustments, small nudges designed to steer rather than confront. Recognition sharpens when you realize how often these nudges succeed, how often you find yourself agreeing not because you are convinced, but because resistance feels unnecessary, tiring, or socially awkward. You recognize that the cost of asserting yourself has increased, not because you are incapable, but because the environment has changed around you. You begin to see how systems of care are built on assumptions that rarely get questioned. Assumptions about risk, about decline, about what is appropriate at a certain age. These assumptions are not always spoken, but they guide behavior. They shape how others interact with you, how they interpret your choices, how they respond to your independence. Recognition is the moment you understand that you are being measured against an invisible template, one that prioritizes safety over autonomy, predictability over preference. When your choices fit the template, they are praised as sensible. When they deviate, they are treated as anomalies that require explanation. You recognize how this template slowly replaces your own internal compass, how you start anticipating what will be considered reasonable before you even decide what you want. There is a particular clarity that comes when you recognize how easily permission is internalized. No one explicitly tells you that you need approval, yet you begin to seek it instinctively. You look for signs of acceptance in others' reactions. You adjust your tone, your timing, your phrasing to minimize concern. This is not because you doubt yourself, but because you have learned that independence now comes with consequences. Consequences not in the form of punishment, but in the form of emotional labor. Extra conversations, reassurances, explanations. Recognition is the realization that these consequences subtly discourage autonomy, that they make self-direction feel burdensome while compliance feels smooth. Over time, this imbalance trains you. It teaches you which choices are worth defending and which are easier to abandon. You start to recognize how your role has shifted in conversations. You are informed more often than you are asked. Decisions are presented as updates rather than discussions. Plans are shared once they are already formed, with your agreement assumed rather than solicited. When you do speak up, it is received as input, not instruction. Recognition is not about resenting this shift, but about seeing it clearly, about acknowledging that consultation has replaced collaboration, that inclusion has replaced leadership. You recognize how subtle this change is, how easily it can be dismissed as efficiency or care, how rarely it is named for what it is. You see how being spared effort is often paired with being spared agency. The pattern extends into daily life in ways that are easy to overlook. Tasks are taken off your hands without discussion. Responsibilities are redistributed quietly. The rationale is always sensible. We just want to make things easier for you. You have enough to worry about. Recognition comes when you ask yourself whether these adjustments truly reflect your needs or whether they reflect others' comfort with managing uncertainty. You see how quickly your capabilities are underestimated, not out of disrespect, but out of habit. You recognize that once this underestimation becomes normal, regaining lost ground requires effort that no one prepares you for. It is easier for others to continue assuming than to recalibrate their view of you. Language continues to reveal itself as a powerful tool in this process. You notice how often decisions are framed as collective when they primarily affect you. We think it would be better if we decided this might be safer. The collective language softens responsibility, making it harder to identify where authority actually lies. Recognition is the moment you see how this language diffuses accountability while consolidating control. When everyone is responsible, no one can be questioned directly. Your disagreement risks sounding ungrateful or confrontational, even when it concerns your own life. You recognize how this dynamic quietly discourages dissent, how it positions your autonomy as something that must be negotiated rather than assumed. You also begin to recognize how routines reinforce this structure. Once a pattern is established, it gains momentum. Decisions made once begin to be repeated automatically. What started as a temporary arrangement becomes permanent by default. Recognition is the awareness that permanence often arrives without ceremony, without review, without explicit consent. You realize how rarely these patterns are revisited, how easily they solidify into expectations. Changing them later feels disruptive, not because the change is unreasonable, but because the system has already adapted around your reduced role. Recognition is seeing how time itself becomes an ally of control, how delays in asserting yourself make future assertions more difficult. There is a deeper layer of recognition that emerges when you reflect on your own responses. You notice how you have learned to signal agreement preemptively, how you nod, how you soften your tone, how you phrase objections as questions. This is not weakness. It is adaptation. But recognition requires honesty. It requires acknowledging that adaptation has a cost, that each time you adjust to maintain harmony, you reinforce the expectation that you will continue to do so. You recognize how easily self-preservation can look like self-surrender when viewed over time. Not because you lack conviction, but because you are navigating a social environment that subtly penalizes independence. Recognition also brings with it a sense of grief, though it is quiet and understated. Not grief for what has been lost entirely, but for what is slipping away unnoticed. The ease with which you once acted, the confidence that your decisions would be accepted without scrutiny, the assumption that your life belonged primarily to you. You recognize that this grief is not about age itself, but about the shifting relationship between you and the world. You see how the world begins to relate to you through a lens of management rather than partnership. This realization is not dramatic, it is sobering. It strips away comforting narratives and leaves you with a clearer view of how autonomy is negotiated, not seized. As recognition deepens, you start to notice how often help arrives before consent, how assistance is offered in ways that leave little room to decline without justification, how refusal requires explanation while acceptance does not. You recognize this asymmetry for what it is, a quiet pressure that shapes behavior without appearing coercive. You see how easily this pressure is internalized, how it begins to guide your own choices even when no one else is present. Recognition is the moment you understand that the most effective control is not imposed externally, but adopted internally through repeated exposure. This stage is not about outrage or resistance. It is about clarity, about seeing the full pattern rather than isolated moments, about understanding that autonomy is rarely taken through force, but through familiarity, through the normalization of small concessions that accumulate over time. Recognition allows you to step back mentally, to observe the process rather than simply participate in it. You see how help becomes control, not because it intends to, but because it is rarely balanced with respect for agency. You see how concern becomes permission when it is allowed to override choice without challenge. Recognition does not yet tell you what to do. It does not offer solutions or strategies. It simply sharpens your awareness of where you stand. It allows you to name what is happening without dramatizing it. It gives you the language internally to understand why something feels off, even when everything appears orderly. This clarity is unsettling, but it is also grounding. It reminds you that autonomy does not disappear all at once. It is negotiated quietly, reshaped through patterns that can only be addressed once they are fully seen. Recognition is the point where you stop mistaking comfort for consent and begin to understand the difference. Loss does not announce itself as loss. It arrives disguised as adjustment, as accommodation, as the reasonable next step in a process that was never openly defined. By the time you feel its weight, it has already settled into your posture, into the way you carry yourself through conversations and decisions. The loss is not of ability or intelligence or relevance, it is the loss of position, the quiet repositioning from being someone whose choices shape the environment to someone who is shaped by it. You begin to feel it in how you are addressed. Not with disrespect, but with carefulness. Sentences are simplified. Explanations are offered before you ask. There is a slight change in tone, a softness that would be comforting if it did not also signal a subtle lowering of expectations. You are no longer assumed to understand immediately. You are guided through things you once navigated instinctively. This guidance is not insulting, yet it carries a message that is hard to ignore. You are being managed now, not consulted. The emotional weight of this shift is difficult to articulate because it is not tied to a single event. There is no moment you can point to and say, this is when it happened. Instead, it accumulates quietly, like sediment. Each small interaction adds another layer, being spoken to more slowly, being reassured more often, being thanked for agreeing. These gestures are not cruel. They are often sincere. And yet together, they create a feeling of being gently moved aside from the center of your own life. Loss reveals itself when you notice that people speak about plans that involve you rather than with you. When decisions are framed as already settled, and your role is to affirm rather than shape them. You are present, but presence is no longer synonymous with power. There is a particular ache that comes from realizing you are no longer surprised by this treatment. The first time it happens, you might question it. The second time, you might rationalize it. By the 10th time, it feels familiar. Familiarity dulls the sharpness of loss, but it does not erase it. Instead, it turns it inward. You stop reacting externally and begin adjusting internally. You temper your responses. You choose words that will not provoke concern. You measure your enthusiasm, your certainty, your willingness to push back. Loss deepens when you realize that you are no longer being spoken to as an equal participant, but as someone whose comfort must be preserved, whose risk must be minimized, whose unpredictability must be managed. This role is rarely assigned explicitly. It emerges through repetition, through patterns that gradually redefine who you are allowed to be. You begin to feel the emotional strain of being constantly interpreted. Your actions are no longer just actions. They are signals. A choice to go somewhere alone becomes a statement about capability. A decision to do something differently becomes a potential cause for worry. You notice how quickly your behavior is read through a lens of decline, even when nothing has changed. This interpretation is exhausting, not because it is overtly negative, but because it requires constant awareness. You are aware of how you will be perceived before you act. You anticipate concern and preempt it. You explain yourself more than you used to. You feel the loss of ease, the loss of acting without commentary. Being managed is not only about having decisions made for you, it is about living under a quiet surveillance of concern, where every choice carries an emotional ripple you are expected to smooth. Loss also reveals itself in how your objections are received. When you disagree, the response is often not engagement but reassurance, as if your resistance itself is a sign of vulnerability. We just want what is best for you. We are only trying to help. These phrases close conversations rather than open them. They reposition your dissent as misunderstanding rather than difference. You are not arguing a point, you are being calmed. This is a profound shift. To be calmed instead of debated is to be subtly removed from the realm of equal authority. Loss deepens when you recognize that your perspective is no longer treated as something that might alter the course of events, but as something that must be managed emotionally. There is a quiet humiliation in this, though it is rarely acknowledged as such. Not humiliation in the sense of being shamed, but in the sense of being diminished without insult. You are respected but not deferred to, valued but not relied upon, included but not entrusted with final say. This form of loss is particularly difficult because it is wrapped in care. Rejecting it feels ungrateful, accepting it feels safe, and yet something inside you resists being reduced to a protected object. You feel the tension between wanting harmony and wanting self-respect. Loss lives in that tension. It is the feeling of being gently handled when you would rather be engaged. As this repositioning continues, you notice changes in how responsibilities are assigned. Tasks that once belonged to you are redistributed quietly. You are relieved of burdens without being asked if you wish to be relieved. The narrative is always one of kindness. You have done enough. Let us take this from you. And yet, with each responsibility removed, a piece of your authority goes with it. Responsibility is not only about labor, it is about relevance. It signals trust, expectation, belief in your capacity to contribute meaningfully. Loss becomes palpable when you realize that being spared effort also means being spared influence. You are no longer needed in the same way, and that absence leaves a hollow space that care alone cannot fill. You begin to feel a subtle loneliness that is not about being alone, but about being unseen as you truly are. People see a version of you shaped by their assumptions, their fears, their desire to protect. That version is smaller, more fragile, more predictable than the person you experience yourself to be. Loss is the gap between these two realities, the gap between how you know yourself and how you are treated. Over time, maintaining this gap requires effort. You must either constantly correct others or quietly adapt to their view. Correction is tiring. Adaptation is numbing. Many choose adaptation without fully acknowledging the cost. Loss deepens when you realize how much of yourself you have set aside to maintain ease in relationships. There is also a loss of risk. Not because you are incapable of risk, but because risk is no longer permitted without negotiation. Others feel entitled to weigh in, to caution, to redirect. Your tolerance for uncertainty is questioned. Your willingness to accept consequences is overridden. This is perhaps one of the most significant losses because risk is tied to agency. To choose risk is to assert ownership over outcomes, good or bad. When risk is managed for you, your life becomes safer but also flatter. Loss emerges in the narrowing of possibility. In the quiet understanding that certain paths are now closed, not by physical limitation, but by social expectation. You feel this loss acutely in moments where your voice should matter most. Decisions about your time, your space, your priorities. When others assume authority over these areas, even gently, something fundamental shifts. You are no longer the unquestioned steward of your own life. This realization carries weight. It is not dramatic. It does not lead to confrontation or tears. It leads to a steady, internal heaviness, a sense that you are being moved, not violently, but persistently, toward a role you did not choose. The role of someone who is cared for rather than someone who directs care, someone whose life is organized rather than lived. Loss also affects how you see yourself. Repeated exposure to being managed can erode confidence in subtle ways. Not confidence in your abilities, but confidence in your right to assert them. You begin to second-guess whether a preference is worth stating, whether an objection is worth raising, whether maintaining control is worth the emotional effort it requires. Over time, this calculus becomes automatic. You conserve energy by letting things go. You tell yourself it does not matter, and sometimes it truly does not. But loss accumulates not from the big things, but from the small ones that are repeatedly surrendered. Each small surrender reinforces the idea that autonomy is optional, negotiable, contingent. There is a quiet anger that sometimes surfaces beneath this loss, though it is often suppressed quickly. Anger feels inappropriate when others are being kind. It feels disproportionate to the situation, and so it is redirected inward, turned into resignation or self-criticism. You tell yourself you are being sensitive. You remind yourself that everyone means well. In doing so, you deny the legitimacy of your own experience. Loss deepens when you no longer trust your own discomfort as valid information. When you dismiss your feelings because they conflict with the narrative of care. Being spoken to differently is one of the most painful aspects of this loss. The change is subtle enough to deny but consistent enough to feel. You are addressed with reassurance rather than respect, with explanation rather than expectation. This change affects how you show up. You become more cautious, more measured, less inclined to speak boldly. Loss reveals itself in the shrinking of your expressive range. In the way you choose safer words, safer tones, safer positions, you begin to occupy less space, not physically, but socially and emotionally. This contraction happens gradually, often without conscious choice. The deepest loss, perhaps, is the sense of authorship, the feeling that your life is something you are actively writing rather than something being edited by committee. When others begin to manage your decisions, your narrative becomes fragmented. You are still living, but the direction feels less clear. You sense that the story of your life is being reframed as something that must be contained, protected, simplified. Loss is the realization that dignity fades before strength, that the erosion of agency often precedes any actual decline, that by the time someone is truly incapable, their autonomy has often been gone for years. This stage is heavy because it offers no immediate resolution. It is not the moment of clarity or empowerment. It is the moment of reckoning with what has already been lost, with the ways you have been repositioned without protest, with the quiet agreements you have made to keep peace. Loss does not demand action yet. It simply asks you to sit with the truth of what has changed, to acknowledge the emotional weight of being managed instead of consulted, to recognize that something essential has been diminished, not through cruelty, but through care that forgot to ask. Clarity does not arrive with relief. It arrives with stillness. After awareness, after recognition, after the quiet weight of loss has settled, there is a moment where the mind stops reaching outward for explanations. The movement inward becomes unavoidable. You stop replaying conversations. You stop measuring tone. You stop cataloging the ways others have shifted around you, not because those things no longer matter, but because you begin to see something more fundamental beneath them. You realize that what has been taken from you externally only had power because something internal was gradually loosened. Not removed, not destroyed, but set aside. Clarity is the moment you understand where autonomy truly lives and why it cannot be taken unless it is surrendered internally first. This realization is calm, almost sobering. It strips away both resentment and self-blame. You see that the loss of control did not begin with others stepping in, but with you stepping back, not out of weakness, but out of courtesy, out of a desire to avoid friction, out of an instinct to preserve harmony. Clarity does not condemn that instinct. It simply places it in context. You understand that your internal authority was never dependent on others' approval, but you allowed it to become entangled with it. Over time, that entanglement blurred the line between cooperation and concession. Clarity is the moment you disentangle those threads, quietly, without needing to announce it to anyone else. You begin to see that autonomy is not primarily expressed through actions, but through posture, an internal posture that determines how you relate to suggestion, concern, and help. When that posture shifts from authorship to accommodation, control naturally follows. Clarity is recognizing that posture before trying to change circumstances. You understand that reclaiming autonomy does not start with refusing help or correcting others. It starts with restoring the internal sense that your life is not subject to consensus, that your preferences do not require validation, that your choices are not provisional until approved. This understanding does not need to be spoken aloud, it only needs to be held firmly inside. With clarity comes a reframing of responsibility. You see that responsibility for your life was subtly outsourced over time, not because you were incapable, but because others were willing. Clarity is the quiet reclaiming of that responsibility, not as a burden but as a right. You recognize that responsibility is inseparable from dignity. To be responsible is to be trusted, first by yourself. You understand now that when you allowed others to manage your decisions, you were not only relieved of effort, but relieved of ownership. Clarity restores that ownership internally, even before it is reflected externally. There is a shift in how you interpret help. You no longer see it as inherently supportive or inherently threatening. You see it as neutral, something that can be accepted or declined without moral weight. Clarity frees you from the false binary, where acceptance equals gratitude and refusal equals ingratitude. You recognize that consent is the missing element that transforms help from control into support, and consent begins internally. Before any conversation takes place, you decide for yourself whether assistance aligns with your will. This decision does not require justification. It does not need to be explained. Clarity is knowing that you are allowed to choose without defending the choice. You begin to understand that dignity is not something others grant you through respect. It is something you maintain through alignment with your own values. When your actions align with your internal authority, dignity is preserved even if others disagree. Clarity dissolves the fear that disagreement equals conflict. You see that conflict only arises when your internal and external positions are misaligned. When you know internally what you will accept and what you will not, your responses become simpler, shorter, calmer. There is less need to persuade, less need to perform reasonableness. Clarity reduces explanation because it reduces uncertainty within you. This understanding changes how you experience conversations. You listen differently, not defensively, not submissively, but selectively. You notice when concern is genuine and when it is habitual. You notice when suggestions are offered as support and when they are offered as direction. Clarity does not require you to challenge every instance. It allows you to choose which ones matter. You realize that autonomy is not maintained through constant resistance, but through consistent self-alignment. You no longer feel compelled to respond immediately. Silence becomes an option again. Pause returns as a tool rather than a sign of hesitation. There is a subtle but profound realization that others' discomfort is not your responsibility to resolve. For a long time, you absorbed that responsibility instinctively. You adjusted your behavior to ease worry, to prevent tension, to reassure. Clarity reveals the cost of that habit. You see that by managing others' emotions, you relinquished control over your own choices. This does not make you selfish, it makes you honest. You understand now that allowing others to feel concern is not cruelty. It is reality. Their feelings do not dictate your authority unless you allow them to. You also begin to see that autonomy is not proven through capability. It is proven through decision. You do not need to demonstrate strength, intelligence, or endurance to justify control over your life. Those qualities may fade over time, but authority does not have to fade with them. Clarity separates autonomy from performance. You recognize that even when assistance is necessary, authorship can remain intact. Being helped does not require being directed. Receiving care does not require surrendering choice. This distinction is subtle but transformative. It redefines what independence truly means. With clarity, the fear of being seen as difficult begins to dissolve. You see that being agreeable at the cost of self-respect is not kindness, it is erasure. Clarity allows you to be firm without being loud, resolute without being combative. You understand that quiet authority is more stable than overt control. It does not provoke, it does not argue, it simply exists. When your internal boundary is clear, others sense it even if they cannot name it. The dynamic shifts without confrontation. You notice changes in yourself before you notice changes in others. You stop over-explaining. You answer questions directly. You allow silence to remain where you once filled it with reassurance. These are small shifts, almost invisible, but they signal a deeper realignment. Clarity is lived before it is recognized. It manifests in how you sit with your choices rather than how you defend them. You feel less urgency to justify, less need to be understood. This does not come from indifference, but from groundedness. There is also a recognition that autonomy is not something you reclaim once and keep forever without effort. It is a position you inhabit daily. Clarity does not promise permanence. It offers awareness. Awareness that you must continuously choose not to cross the internal line where your authority is outsourced for comfort. You see that this line is crossed not through grand decisions, but through small, repeated concessions. Clarity is knowing where that line is for you, knowing when assistance becomes intrusion, when concern becomes control, when cooperation becomes surrender. You understand now that no one can protect your autonomy for you, not family, not systems, not good intentions. They can support it if you hold it. They will replace it if you abandon it. This realization is not cynical. It is realistic. It restores agency without demanding confrontation. Clarity is not about rejecting care or isolating yourself. It is about redefining the terms under which care is received. It is about maintaining internal authorship regardless of external involvement. As this clarity settles, there is a quiet sense of steadiness. Not optimism, not triumph, simply steadiness, the kind that comes from understanding something fundamental about yourself and the world. You see that autonomy is not granted at a certain age and revoked at another. It is gradually negotiated through daily interactions, and the most important negotiation always happens inside you, long before anyone else is involved. Clarity is the moment you stop mistaking comfort for safety and start recognizing self-direction as the true source of dignity. This stage does not end with action. It ends with alignment. Your internal compass is no longer outsourced. Your sense of authority is no longer contingent. You are aware of what cannot be taken unless you give it away. This awareness does not require announcement. It does not require validation. It simply reshapes how you move through the world, quietly, deliberately, with a renewed understanding of where autonomy truly resides and why it has always been yours to hold. Quiet autonomy does not announce itself. There is no declaration, no moment where others are informed that something has changed. In fact, the absence of announcement is part of its strength. What shifts now happens internally, almost invisibly. and only later becomes perceptible in the way you move through the world. You do not confront. You do not correct. You do not demand to be seen differently. You simply stop crossing a line inside yourself, a line that once blurred under pressure, habit, and good intentions. Quiet autonomy begins the moment you stop explaining your right to choose and start inhabiting it without commentary. This new internal posture is subtle. It does not feel like resistance. It feels like ownership. Decisions are no longer rehearsed in advance for acceptability. You decide first internally, before considering how the choice might be received. That sequence matters. When decision comes before explanation, authority is preserved. You notice that you are less preoccupied with how others will respond. Not because you no longer care, but because care is no longer confused with permission. Quiet autonomy is the separation of empathy from surrender. You can understand concern without allowing it to override your will. There is a calm discipline in this posture. You no longer rush to respond. When suggestions are offered, you let them land without immediately accommodating them. Silence returns as a neutral space, not a defensive one. You allow yourself time to feel whether a suggestion aligns with you or not. Sometimes it does, and you accept it without resistance. Sometimes it does not, and you decline without justification. The absence of justification is not hostility, it is clarity. Quiet autonomy understands that explanations are often invitations to negotiate authority. By offering fewer of them, you reduce the need to defend what was never up for debate. You begin to notice that your energy is conserved, not because life has become easier, but because you are no longer managing other people's expectations in advance. That management required constant adjustment, constant vigilance. Quiet autonomy releases you from that labor. You allow others to experience their own reactions without rushing to soften them. This is not indifference. It is respect for emotional boundaries. Their feelings belong to them. Your choices belong to you. This separation creates a steadiness that others may feel even if they cannot articulate it. There is no attempt to reclaim lost ground theatrically. You do not insist on doing everything yourself to prove capability. You understand now that autonomy is not performance. You accept help when it serves your intent, not when it serves others' comfort. The difference is internal but decisive. Assistance becomes a tool rather than a directive. You receive it without gratitude that borders on obligation. You decline it without guilt. Quiet autonomy removes the moral weight from choice. There is no virtue in compliance and no vice in refusal. There is only alignment. Over time, others may begin to adjust, not because you demanded it, but because consistency reshapes expectations. When you respond calmly, firmly, and without excess explanation, the dynamic changes. People sense where the boundary is, even if it is never named. Some may test it. Others may retreat slightly. A few may feel uncomfortable. Quiet autonomy does not rush to resolve that discomfort. It allows it to exist. You have learned that harmony purchased at the cost of self-respect is fragile. Real stability requires internal coherence, not constant agreement. You also notice a shift in how you speak. Your words become simpler, more direct. You state preferences without softening them excessively. You answer questions without anticipating objections. This is not abruptness. It is precision. Quiet autonomy strips away unnecessary cushioning. You no longer feel responsible for making every choice palatable. You trust that clarity, delivered without aggression, is sufficient. If it is not, that is information, not a problem to be fixed immediately. There is a deeper dignity that emerges from this posture, not the kind that seeks recognition, but the kind that remains intact regardless of recognition. You feel it in how you inhabit your time, how you decide what matters, how you allow yourself to want things without editing desire through expectation. Quiet autonomy restores intimacy with your own intentions. You begin to feel less fragmented, less divided between what you want and what you present. This integration is subtle, but it is powerful. It makes you less susceptible to quiet erosion. You understand now that autonomy is not loud independence or isolation. It is the steady presence of choice, even in limitation, even in dependence, even in moments where assistance is necessary. Quiet autonomy insists on authorship, not self-sufficiency. You may accept support, guidance, or care, but the final authority remains internal. This understanding frees you from the fear of future vulnerability. You see that needing help does not automatically place you under control unless you relinquish authorship internally. There is a certain peace in this realization, though it is not comforting in a sentimental way. It is grounded. It allows you to age without disappearing, to adapt without erasing yourself, to remain present in your life even as circumstances change. Quiet autonomy is not about preserving the past. It is about maintaining continuity of self. You remain the same author even as the chapters change. You no longer measure independence by how much you do alone, but by how much choice you retain. This redefinition matters. It protects you from the quiet narratives that equate aging with retreat. You see that withdrawal often begins internally, long before it is visible externally. By refusing to cross that internal line, you prevent the slow handover of your life to well-meaning systems and assumptions. Quiet autonomy is vigilance without paranoia, awareness without bitterness. There is no final victory in this stage, no sense of completion. Quiet autonomy is ongoing. It is practiced daily in small decisions, in pauses, in the refusal to over-explain. It is renewed each time you notice pressure and choose alignment instead. This practice does not require strength in the conventional sense. It requires attentiveness, a willingness to notice when you are about to step back unnecessarily, a commitment to remain present in your own decision-making. You move forward now with a different relationship to the world, less reactive, less apologetic, more centered. The world may continue to offer help, guidance, concern. Some of it will be useful, some of it will not. Quiet autonomy gives you the internal structure to discern the difference without drama. You do not need to resist everything. You only need to avoid crossing the one line that matters, the line where your authority over your own life is handed over quietly, in exchange for comfort, approval, or ease. You stay on your side of that line without announcing it, without proving it, without asking permission. That is what keeps you independent, not defiance, not isolation, but the quiet, consistent ownership of choice. Even as time moves forward, even as roles shift, even as the world means well, quiet autonomy is how you remain yourself without making noise about it.